Hi folks, today I thought I'd talk a little bit about the upcoming Chicago Marathon. My first couple of tips on weather really applies to any marathon, but the rest of this is all going to be very Chicago specific, but if you're not doing Chicago, you're still, of course, welcome to watch and give some feedback. I've done Chicago 3 times. I've been down to the race, I think probably 4 or 5 times when I lived up in the area, supporting runners from our running club that were in a training program down there doing it. So I think I know the race fairly well. And let's face it, there are all kinds of videos, blogs, there's all kinds of tips out there about the Chicago Marathon. So I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just going to cover what I think are a few key things that you might not get someplace else. So the first one is going to be the weather. Don't get sucked in. And what I mean by that is you're probably going to need to make some type of an adjustment to what you're doing with the race based upon what's going to happen with the weather. Now, that doesn't always happen. The first time I did Chicago was 2006. It was about 40 degrees with a very light drizzle, overcast, and it stayed that way the entire race. It was great weather. There was never any need to adjust. But in my experience, usually you're going to have to make some type of adjustment for the weather. Will that happen this year? We don't know. So what do I mean by don't get sucked in? So first of all, no matter what the forecast says, it's likely going to be warmer than the forecast. Between the people in the race and the volunteers and the crowd, you've got 2 million people that are down there. They're lining the streets. You got black asphalt. You got tall buildings, narrow streets, holding the heat in. It's going to be warmer than you think. Maybe 4 or 5 degrees warmer than what the weather says. So if the forecast says 60, you might as well feel like it's going to be more like 65 when you get into the race, just because it's like that. So remember the tall buildings and everything else. But here's the other big thing with adjusting for the weather. Typically, the weather that you start in is going to be different than the weather that you finish in. And what you always want to be doing is adjusting your pace, if you need to make an adjustment, based upon the worst weather conditions you will have during your race, not the best. And this is probably the single biggest mistake I've seen people make, is getting sucked in by the relatively better feeling weather earlier and then dying at the end. So I'll give you an example from 2017, which is the last time I happened to be down at the race. So in 2017, at 8 in the morning, it was 56 degrees and 90% humidity. That's a little bit high humidity, but it's that early morning stuff that tends to burn off right away. But at noon, 4 hours later, it was 73 degrees, 56% humidity, which is great. But it was also sunny. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, which means when that sun is beating down on you in those black roads, it feels a good 10 plus degrees warmer. So it's more like 80, 85 degrees at the finish. So what happens is the people that were starting at 8, running right around 4 hours, they're out there in that 56 going, wow, this feels awesome, and they end up going too fast. What they need to do is say, I got to pretend I'm running a race in 80 degrees. What would my pace be for an 80-degree day? And what happens is in the first quarter of the marathon, first third of the marathon, it feels way too slow because the weather is still really good. But trust me, worst case, you get to mile 20 and you got all kinds of energy to say, Mark is an idiot. I could have been going faster than fine. Then start picking it up as you get into the later parts of the race. But again, I've seen a whole lot of people get out feeling great, but they're not feeling so great by the end. So don't get sucked in by the weather, but hopefully this year, you won't have to worry about the weather at all. GPS is useless. Maybe you've heard this. All the tall buildings, your GPS is not going to be accurate. It's not going to give you the correct mileage. It's not going to give you the correct pacing. So what I recommend doing is not worrying about the pace on your watch. Look at the mile markers, use the lap feature if you really want to know what your paces are, and go by that, because GPS is not going to be helpful for you. Tangents. I think everybody's heard about, cutting tangents, making sure you're going on the inside of the curves. In fact, Chicago typically has a blue line painted on the street to show you where all the tangents are so you don't overrun the course. But here's the problem with that. Depending where you are in the pack, sometimes it gets so bogged down with everybody trying to run the tangents that every time you come to a curve, you end up slowing down because it's just jam-packed with people. I usually recommend go ahead and go to the outside. I think you're better off to maintain an even pace, even if it means you're going to run a little bit farther than that slow down. Because what happens when you slow down, your next tendency is going to be, I got to make that up. And then you start going too fast. And think about your car. If you drove a car like that, slow, fast, that's terrible for your mileage. It's the same thing with your body. So try and do the tangents, but don't get married to the tangents, especially if those inside curves are turns or curves, I guess it would be, are going to be bogged down. Mile 26 is the Roosevelt Bridge. It's pretty much the only hill on the course. So here's what happens with the Roosevelt Bridge. I'll use the example of if you go to grade school. When you're in grade school and they have these huge water fountains that are really tall, and then you go back to grade school as an adult and they're these little bitty things and they're really low. That's what the Roosevelt Bridge is. It's really not very big. But when it's mile 26 in the marathon, it looks like a mountain is looming in front of you. But I'll guarantee you go back the next day and look at that bridge, you go, this is it? That's the bridge I was climbing? It's not that big of a deal. So just prepare yourself mentally, know that that is coming, know that it's probably going to look big, and realize it's really not very big. Use the crowds. You're probably going to get this tip from almost any place you go, but the crowd support there is tremendous. No matter what the weather has been, there are people 2 and 3 deep pretty much along the entire course. So you can really feed off that energy of the crowd to keep you going, looking for those smiling faces, and they're clapping and give high fives to the crowd. So really use those crowds. And probably the last thing is, you've probably trained all summer for this. Chicago is a fantastic race. When you get out there, have fun, run fearless, and have a great race.